Hello and welcome to this Construction News webinar. My name is Lem Bingley and I'm the editor of Construction News. And today we'll be looking at how circular economies can drive greater sustainability in construction. I know sustainability is a topic of real focus at the moment across the industry. In the wake of the COP26 climate summit just a few months ago, responsible businesses right across the sector are working to reduce the impact of their own operations. Clients are putting sustainability measures into their contracts, and the public sector is demanding not just carbon savings now, but biodiversity gains as well. Since September, indeed, bidders for government work over £5 million must not only demonstrate a net zero roadmap, but also, importantly, a plan to reduce their waste. But with rising prices for building materials and the imminent removal of the red diesel rebate, it's a really challenging time for construction. So I'm grateful to specialist supplier Westgate for sponsoring today's session, which I hope will provide some helpful pointers for everyone watching. Now, a panel of experts will be joining me in just a moment to discuss these topics. We are scheduled to run for about an hour, and we'll be taking live questions via the Q&A function, which I hope you can see on your screen. So please don't hold back, do post questions as soon as they occur to you. And we'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can. So if our panelists could now switch on their cameras and unmute, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Schooling, Director of the Centre for Smart Infrastructure at the University of Cambridge, by Liebetanz, Sustainability Advisor at the UK Green Building Council, and Tim Carson, Head of Projects at our sponsor Westgate. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves now and say a few words of background. Jennifer, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you very much, Lem. Good morning, everybody. As Lem said, I'm Jennifer Schooling. I am the Director of the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction, or CSIC for short. At CSIC, we work with industry partners to understand how we can use better data and digital information to improve the whole life cycle of our built environment. So from design through to construction, operation and management, and then the planning for new infrastructure as we need it. And in the context of circular economy, we're very much looking at how we can, in the first instance, reduce waste and also use better data to think about how we can design for reuse, but also, understand how we reuse components that have had a previous life, as it were.
Thanks, Jennifer. Kai.
Good morning. I'm Kai Liebetanz, Sustainability Advisor for UK Green Building Council, and I'm leading our work on circular economy here. And I'm also involved in the nature and biodiversity work that we do. I've been previously employed as an environmental designer, working on whole life sustainability concepts and doing building performance modeling. Joined the UKGBC about a year ago, where, as I said, took over the circular economy work that we do. Mainly focusing on reuse of materials, looking at whole life carbon costs of circular economy. We're also running the Circular Economy Forum, which is a group of very engaged industry professionals looking at working through challenges of circular economy, providing guidance to the industry. Yeah, over to you, Lem.
Thanks very much, Kai. And finally, Tim, if you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Head of Projects at Westgate. We're a provider of partitioning solutions across the UK and Europe. Our activities range from industrial dividers through to UPVC site hoarding systems that are popular on construction sites, such as Hoardfast and Hoardfence. Those are probably our products that are most applicable to today's webinar and contribute well towards the ideal of the circular economy. These help our clients and their customers to tangibly contribute towards their sustainability goals on site and saving waste.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. I can see there are quite a number of people who've joined the call since I started the introduction, and just a reminder that we'll be taking live questions. So if you do have questions for our panel, please use the Q&A function on the screen. But first, I'll put some questions to our panel. Jennifer, perhaps you could start us off by sort of setting the scene, as it were. Not everyone will necessarily know what we mean when we talk about a circular economy. So could you give us a brief overview and how it might apply to those people who work in construction?
So essentially, circular economy is about being good custodians of our planetary resources and avoiding, as far as possible, ever sending anything to waste. So the principles of it are to reduce the amount of resources that we use. Once we've used the resources, can we look to reusing them or repurposing them? If we can't reuse or repurpose, then we go for recycling. And the idea is that we never go for refuse, as it were. And as far as possible, we want to keep the value of any materials as high as possible. So if we think about the classic milk bottle, for example, milk used to get delivered to our doors. We'd drink the milk, put the milk bottle back outside for the milkman to collect, but we go back, get cleaned, and be reused. And the value of that milk bottle remained high. If the milk bottle gets cracked, then the next best thing we can do with it is either use it as a vase or send it to recycling. Now, the problem with sending it to recycling is essentially it gets ground up, so its value is reduced as an object, and it becomes raw material again. So it's obviously in the context of construction, what we're looking at is lots of concrete and cement, steel, glass, and so forth, and looking at how we can both design for reusing components. So if we can make a building that's, for example, that's deconstructible, or a bridge that's deconstructible, could we then repurpose it somewhere else if its useful life comes to an end in its existing location, or repurpose the individual components? If we can't repurpose the individual components, then can we easily strip out the component materials and reuse those, or put them through the recycling process? So the idea is always to try and keep the sort of the value that you've already put into something as high as possible for as long as possible. And as I say, never to take a wrecking ball to something and send things to landfill.
And presumably that's not just, you're not just talking about within one particular organisation, but it's working with different partners as well to make sure that value is sustained, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, one of the challenges that we often have, obviously, in construction is, moving large quantities of cement and concrete around, and we traditionally overorder to make sure we've got enough material. But then what do you do with the overordered material when you've used as much as you need? Well, in an ideal world in a circular economy, if you've got a large site, you just send it to the next job on that site, and you'd have coordinated your pours so that you can start the next pour. Reality is that often you don't have a large site, but if you're in a large city like London or Manchester with lots of construction going on, could we create a market for the opportunity to, site A doesn't need this concrete lorry, can we divert it to site B because we know that they're going to need the same specification on their job, and they're pouring now or in 20 minutes time. But the challenge with all of that, of course, with concrete in particular, is that you've only got a finite amount of time to use it from the moment it's batched. But with steel and glass and wood and so forth, there's absolutely no reason why we can't send things to another site. And we should never send virgin material off site to either recycling or landfill. That's just criminal.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's really helpful. Tim, from your perspective as a supplier to the industry, I mean, how do you see circular principles applying to your business?
Well, I completely agree with Jennifer. I think the number one is to make sure that virgin material doesn't go off site, and also that we maintain as much resource within the system as we can at any one time. And that can even go as far as actually prolonging the use and the life cycle of what is already on site, and looking after it when it's on site to make sure that it has a longer life cycle before it even needs to get to the end of that life. I think we need the ecosystem within the industry that allows for reduced waste and encourages the reuse and recycling of those resources. But a couple of examples that I would be able to provide where we've been involved in that sort of thing, and I've been involved in my career, is, for example, designing in the full life cycle of a building from the start. I think when it's a temporary building, for example, a sports stadium I worked upon in London, we installed helical piles, which were made of steel for the foundation of that, because it only had a limited couple of year lifespan. So that when the product was finished with and the building was taken down, they were all wound out of the ground and they were recycled, and those resources weren't lost. And there was a minimal footprint exerted upon the ground. So that was just completely designed in from the start. When it comes to designing buildings full stop, I think we need to really focus hard on designing the disassembly of those and the demolition of those up front, so that as much can be salvaged as possible. And I actually see that as being a bit like planting an oak tree from a sapling now. People of my age won't get to see that oak grow, but people in the future will. And I think if we can design now for disassembly and demolition, then in many, many years' time, when those buildings reach the end of their life, those people will see the beneficial impacts of that, and those materials can be salvaged. Also then from actual building the buildings on the construction site, I think we have to focus massively again on design, but also on processes and upon the materials that we use. So we need to make sure that we're looking after the materials on the work site, the plant on the work site, along that life cycle of it, and also using reusable construction materials, such as, for example, in temporary materials. So we've got hoarding, such as ourselves, we provide that. That reduces waste from the start, because we aren't using timber anymore that is then going into skips and getting taken off site after a product. It can be used again and again and again. We're actually diverting waste from landfill anyway, because they're made from recyclable materials, largely. So once the project finishes, that hoarding can get moved on to another project and another project. And then when it really does finish the end of its life cycle, it can be recycled 100% and put straight back into the pot, as it were, of resources that we have to play with as an economy, as an ecosystem.
Thanks, Tim. Kai, from your perspective, the work you do at UK GBC, you must work with various different companies. How do you see that this circular thinking translating into practical things within your work?
Yeah, I mean, true. We work with lots of different organizations all across the supply chain and the life cycle. And I'm actually very glad that everybody who's spoken here so far mentioned the importance of the life cycle, because I think that's crucial. One thing that we do a lot of times is that we equate circular economy with waste and recycling and waste management. But that's very short-term thinking, because that's just the very end of the cycle, and that's just one problem that we created early on in the process. So it's very important that we talk to everybody, engage everybody in the supply and value chain in the entire life cycle, and also look at the beginning of the life cycle, where we, as we've discussed before, where it's about virgin materials, bringing them into place, and how can we design that out in the first place. And then another thing which we have also touched on is the infrastructure bit of it. So it's not enough to just say this is recyclable or this is reusable, and you can do that. It's also then about how this actually happens. If you have a building and you design it, say this is, you can take it apart, you can disassemble that, and you can reuse everything. How does that actually translate into reality? So how do we make that happen? So because the normal process would be you have a demolition contractor going on site, not knowing about that, knocking the building down, which limits the possibilities that you have afterwards. So this whole life cycle thinking, I think is crucial here.
Thanks, Kai. I'll stay with you if that's okay, Kai. Are there particular pitfalls or misconceptions, mistakes that companies might make when they embark on this kind of thinking? Or, you know, I'm thinking we hear the phrase greenwashing from time to time. Is that sort of thing a risk when it comes to embarking on sort of circular thinking?
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe the good note here is that you can actually do quite a lot if you embed it early on. So circular economy can, if you address it early, if you put it in the design brief, you can do a lot of things. Simple things like using mechanical fixings over glue and chemical bonds. Make sure that you can take things apart. Don't use composites. A lot of those things are, it's not that they are unavoidable. Most of the things, it's just there is a design alternative. You just need to choose it. You need to be aware of that. So I think it's awareness, and then also things like concerns about warranty and risk of, especially again talking about reused and secondhand materials. There are lots of concerns about taking a steel beam out of one building, putting it into another building. Is that still okay quality wise? Thing is, most of those concerns can be dealt with and overcome quite easily. You just need to have the awareness. You need to know what to do. And again, this is something that you can avoid if you put it early in the design brief. You have experts on the team who know how to point you in the right directions. And then maybe a last thing, just be a bit more flexible in your building design and in your finishes. It's the way we traditionally built is you have this big architectural vision, and then you specify out every single detail, every single finish, and expect that to be delivered on point. If we move away from that a bit, it gives us a lot more flexibility to make circular economy happen.
And obviously, if we have sort of design and build type of relationships, that's a great opportunity for contractors to influence the sustainability of what's done as well, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's going this way. We've just had the other day, actually yesterday, a meeting together with contractors to sort of tackle it from the, again, entire life cycle and make sure that we don't just put all the risk on the contractors, that we say as clients or architects, this is what we want, and we want this building to be 100% circular, and now there you go, contractor, please figure that out. So there are legitimate concerns about, like, how do we actually deliver this? If somebody tells me to use recycled steel or reused steel, where do I procure this? How do I go about this? So involving every party in this process is crucial. And I think we're on the right track to do that.
Thanks, Kai. Jennifer, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things I'd add to that. I think just on Kai's last point, there's a piece around risk sharing. In our industry, we have traditionally tried to sort of shovel risk down the supply chain as far as possible. And I think we need to use those more sort of collaborative styles of contract for this, where contractors, designers and clients share the risk in an appropriate way. But I think the other thing, just going back to your sort of point about pitfalls, fundamentally, this is about eliminating waste. So absolutely, we should think about how we make the materials that we're going to put into a building reusable at the end of life. But we should also look at what's on the site already. Can we repurpose what's there rather than knocking it down and starting again? So perhaps we should challenge ourselves as an industry to include the demolition of the pre-existing structure as part of the waste that we count for the project and part of the carbon that we count for the project, because that's all been invested in already. And if we reuse it, then we don't create new carbon and use new materials. And then the second thing is we need to be so much better about how we manage processes on site. And Tim alluded to this, but we waste so much material. We are very poor as an industry at the moment at digital data generation and collection. So one of my students is doing some work on how can we help improve this. And she was on a very well managed construction site actually recently on a highways project. And one of the cement lorries turned up at the gate and 4 people came to collect information from it. Now, if we just digitize the data collection, one person would do that and the other 3 people would have access to it. So, not only does it help us manage data better, but it reduces man hours in doing pointless tasks. Every single one of those people would have had a higher value activity they could have been doing if they hadn't been going down to take the data from the lorry. So if we can be much better at converting our data capture to digital data capture, really understanding where we're using materials on a site. So the other thing that you sometimes find, again, talking about cement for a moment and over-ordering, is you've got more cement than you needed for the high value job. So you've ordered a high grade cement, you've got more than you needed. So you then use it for a much lower grade job and you probably use much more than you needed, for something like citing a survey point or something like that. So that, although we never count that as waste because it doesn't leave the site in a skip or in a waste lorry, it is actually wasted material. It's high grade material used for a low grade purpose. So we need as an industry to start to track exactly what material is coming onto site, exactly how that material is used. And this is, it seems like a difficult thing to do, but it's not rocket science. It's something that's been around in the logistics industry for a long time. And the other thing that I think Tim alluded to as well is if we've got materials on site, we need better inventory for that. And we need to make sure that the materials are stored in such a way that if they don't need to be used, they can go back into the supply chain and they haven't been damaged on the way. And that we don't just lose stuff because, on large construction sites, big infrastructure construction sites, it's not uncommon for people to have to spend hours, if not days, wondering where on earth that rebar went. And it's sitting somewhere because we haven't got good digital control of our processes yet. So yeah, I think I would just urge us as an industry to start to adopt that sort of data management approach that we've seen in a lot of other industries for a long time.
I mean, that's absolutely a fundamental part of reducing waste is to make sure you get the right stuff, that you've ordered the right stuff, that it turns up at the right time, and you get red bricks and not yellow bricks,
and that where you put it once it's arrived. This is, as I say, it's not rocket science.
I would agree with that. And I think where we are at this particular moment is we look back at these pictures of health and safety situations where 30 years ago we were doing things that we never dreamed of doing now on a construction site. And I genuinely feel that where we are as an industry now and where we're moving towards, we'll have that same sort of epiphany in 10 years' time. People that come into the industry will look back and they'll say, what do you mean you didn't know where that rebar was? Well, what do you mean you didn't know how much concrete you needed or how much materials was required on a particular work site? Because the digital construction that we're doing now up front to make sure that we know exactly what we're building, I think we just need to integrate that now into the supply chain so that we know exactly what materials are required, track that, as you said, Jennifer, and to understand exactly the construction sites that we're working with, and we'll become much more efficient. So the slight mechanization there of the construction sites. I think you look at car factories, you look at any other factory, they don't have extra materials on the end of production lines. They don't have skips at the end of production lines. They know what's coming in and they know what's going to be used. And that's the efficiency that's there through the lean processes that are used. And I think we need to, or we've started to, but that journey of getting that into construction so that it becomes a lot more specific and efficient, I think is going to get us a long way to where we need to be.
And Tim, you talked about diverting materials from landfill. I mean, as you say, your company takes in waste, turns it into something useful. Are the lessons you've learned from that approach, is that approach that Westgate uses developed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're spot on, it has developed over time and everybody is still looking to improve that as best we can moving forward. One of the pitfalls I think that we've come up against and that the industry has come up against is that it took a while for recycled materials to be accepted as not being inferior. I think that was quite an old view. And I think now recycled materials are seen essentially as actually of a higher value to an extent, and they're much more sought after because of the perceived value and benefits sustainability wise, and also from a financial perspective. So I think we have seen a shift in that over the last few years as well, where it's much more accepted on site to use recycled materials, and in fact preferred in a lot of ways as we're getting to now. Thanks, Tim.
I'm going to switch over to some questions from the audience since quite a few have come in. Kai, maybe you could tackle this question. We have a question from Alistair Ramage asking, how does this circular thinking fit into the more sort of traditional measures that a business worries about, like making money, revenue, profit, staffing, etc.? What advice would you give? I mean, presumably if you can start to reduce your waste, buy less stuff in the first place, that's the most basic way that you might save money, but there are other tips you can offer, Kai?
I think it doesn't. The first thing to note here will be that similar to other sustainability ideas and concepts, it doesn't necessarily affect cost. There are ways it can increase the cost, there are ways it can decrease the cost, but it's just the idea that sustainability comes at a cost is fundamentally the wrong way of thinking. So I mean it depends. Maybe you have some sort of reused materials, therefore you need to change the design a bit. Maybe the program is a bit longer, that could increase the cost. Similarly, if you switch to other circular economy principles like prefabrication, that might actually decrease the program, which means decreasing the cost. So I think it comes down to proper planning and awareness of the different parameters of the process. Yeah, I wouldn't get into detail and say like this is how you save the cost and this is how the cost increases. It's highly contextual, I'd say.
And Jennifer, I could see you nodding along to some of Kai's remarks. What advice would you give people who, I mean, presumably anytime you try and sort of rejig your business processes, there's a sort of upfront cost of thinking about how to do things differently, but presumably you can find some savings along the way if you're going to reduce waste, etc.
Yeah, well, I think interestingly, people anticipate that these things are going to cost more, but they often end up costing less. I mean, there's a great example of Anglian Water quite a few years ago now, took the bold step when this wasn't quite as on the headlines as it is today, took the bold step of saying we want all of our construction programs to reduce their carbon emissions. And everyone went, that's going to cost you. And when they actually did it, what they found was it reduced their costs because people had to think really hard about how much of what kind of material they were using, where they were going to deploy it, how they were going to manage, vehicle movements on site, whether they were going to where they were going to use diesel-powered vehicles and where they were going to be able to switch to electric and that kind of thing. So in fact, the reality was it didn't cost more. And I think for a lot of these things, I mean, going back to the good old milk bottle example, the traditional dairy would not have brought bottles back and washed them and reused them if that hadn't been the cheapest and most efficient thing to do. Nowadays, we're all used to having throwaway plastic cartons, but that wasn't the paradigm before. And I think, you know, we just need to reconfigure our mindset to say, actually, these things are possible. Just because we haven't been doing them for the last 30 or 40 years doesn't mean we shouldn't restart doing the things that we used to do where they were good, or implement new systems going forward. I think, you know, all of the things around having an infrastructure, as Kai said, to facilitate reuse of things, you know, that needs to be developed, and that needs a pull from every bit of the industry. Clients need to say there is a market for this. We want this in our buildings to enable the supply chain to facilitate that. And, you know, that might involve with, I don't know, I-beams and things like that, them going back to a manufacturer and being scanned or something like that. I used to work in the manufacturing industry, and we used to reuse very high quality, highly stressed components over and over again, but we would just inspect them thoroughly before we reused them to check that they were still serviceable. So all of these things can be done. We just need to build up enough, we just need to build up enough head of steam and momentum within the industry to make it happen at scale, I think.
And there are some fundamental principles at work here. I mean, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I know in other industries, like in the automotive sector, there's been a big effort to try and measure the value of the stuff they're chucking out, to sort of put a price on what's going in the skip, and then seeing if they can reduce the cost of the materials that you know, you've got to pay for that steel. If you cut out a car door and then you chuck a load of steel away, that's scrap. If you can reduce that, then you can influence the bottom line. But you can't do that until you start measuring it. So.
And interestingly, I saw an article just yesterday actually about the cost of carbon for the Lower Thames Crossing project. Now, they haven't increased the amount of cement they're planning on using, but overnight the cost of carbon has almost doubled because the way carbon is taxed has increased. So the other thing we've got to be aware of is if we don't smarten up our act on this, it's going to cost us more. And the sooner we can start getting ahead of the game, the less likely we are to get clobbered by taxes that we hadn't thought about and hadn't seen coming. You know, that's just the reality of where we are in the world today.
Yes, the tax man's always going to get you. Tim, I think you wanted to have a word as well on this issue.
I was just thinking about the raising the horizons as well. I think sometimes when we're looking at cost savings, we have to look above our just one building site, and we have to look at what else is going on in that particular area for efficiencies that we can gain, purchasing, deliveries, that kind of thing as well. So I think it is raising that horizon and not just focusing on one work site. I think we have to change things as a movement within the industry for everybody to sort of raise that horizon and have a look at the wider opportunities that are ahead, because I don't think that we will make those massive changes by focusing on one construction site at a time. I think it has to be an overall thought process and everybody getting in together. Really.
Thanks, Tim. Kai, coming back to you.
Yeah, just maybe one thing to add there in terms of cost. I'd also anticipate buildings that fully employ circular economy principles to retain their value in a better way. Like if you build in layers, for example, it makes maintenance easier. You can have more flexibility in the building. So if the building is ever at some point is not fit for purpose anymore, you can change it in an easier way. And ultimately, at the end of its life, it's basically material storage. So you can then take it apart, sell off the materials in an ideal world. So there is a lot of opportunity. And I think as soon as this becomes common practice, I'd say it retains its value better.
Thanks, Kai. We'll move on to another question here. It's about, I mean, obviously within construction, we work within complex sets of relationships and supply chain. Tim, maybe from your perspective, you can talk about this, sort of who is best placed, do you think, within the chain of command, as it were, to influence the adoption of circular principles? Is it the tier one contractors? Is it the clients that are going to have to drive this? What do you think, Tim?
Well, ultimately, everyone's got a part to play, haven't they? I think there's no passengers in the proper ecosystem when it's developed. I think clients need to be braver at tender stage with what they specify, but they also can't possibly be up to date with all of the latest innovations and trends. So contractors, tier one, etc., need to be brave enough to then propose back innovative solutions to inform the clients. So there's a bit of a reciprocal arrangement there. I think design-wise, we need to design for construction, design out waste, design for disassembly, as we've all discussed today. It's definitely a hot topic. And then contractors on site need to plan better, get the full site buy-in, and have that ethos of no such thing as waste. Supply chain-wise, it also comes down to the materials providers as well. I'd love to see a disruptor come into the market who offered essentially a return facility for materials purchased that haven't been used. I think we need to do a lot of that at home, but when it comes to the work site, once it's been purchased, it essentially stays on site, and there isn't that mechanism yet for moving materials around to other work sites. It's certainly not that's robust enough and incredible enough at this particular moment. So I think material suppliers can actually do that. I think if somebody came into the market and offered that service, I think they would see a lot of benefits, and then the other suppliers would then also need to follow suit with that. I think there'll be a lot of gains for them with that. Ultimately, I think one of the big drivers is inadvertently going to be market forces, because where we are at the moment, we're seeing a lot of price increases on raw materials, and we are seeing a lot of scarcity of materials. And where we are with that is the prices are rising, lead times are rising, and it's actually forcing the industry to be more efficient, because we're having to use less materials, we're having to watch the costs more to maintain our margins. And whilst I would prefer, I think we'd all prefer, that the industry change to a more circular economy and a sustainable economy for ethical reasons, in reality, the catalyst may actually be financial and scarcity of resource reasons that drives us to that change. But ultimately, I think it will get us in that same place. So I think the market forces will actually bind everybody together over the coming years. But ultimately, everyone's got a part to play in that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Just a word, obviously you can, if you don't have a question, but you see somebody's already asked the question that you'd like to see answered, there's an ability to upvote questions here, and I'm going to look at one that's got a couple of votes here from Ian Goodridge. It kind of relates to what we were just talking about, but Kai, I'm going to come to you with it. Can we see the emergence of sort of partnerships based around these circular principles? And the example you hear mentioned by Ian is a tier one contractor establishing a relationship with a demolition contractor that it knows is going to do a good job of that sort of recapturing value from a building as it's deconstructed. Are you seeing that those sorts of relationships emerge, Kai?
Absolutely, yeah. So I don't want to tell names and who that is, but in our membership, we can see a lot of that. A lot of people who are very engaged in the circular economy agenda. They all work together on different projects, and they know they can trust each other. They have our support. So yeah, definitely, it's just also a matter of people who see this as a matter of urgency and who push for it, and you just avoid having those discussions, time-consuming discussions early on in a project, and you build up experience. I think the big challenge then from there on is how do we invite people to join these partnerships, to not be too exclusive, and how do we share the knowledge that this becomes the norm and not just a couple of enlightened people who keep pushing the industry forward. But yeah, I can definitely see that, and I can see more and more people coming into that space.
I guess those sorts of relationships will form sort of naturally as people see that things working together works well, and from this perspective. Moving on to another question, Jennifer, perhaps you can tackle this one. As Mike Davis, the person asking the question, has mentioned, you talked about the role of digitization, and I think Mike's looking for a particular steer. Are there solutions out there that you'd recommend, or what kind of things should people be looking for that will help them use digital data to embark on this kind of journey?
There are some SMEs out there who are offering solutions. So one that comes to the top of my mind is QFlow, because we work with them, but QualityFlow they're also called. But I'm sure there are others out there who are trying to help begin that journey towards digitalization of data. Some of the bigger contractors are looking at developing their own apps to do that. The challenge with some of these things is then, classically you've got 3 or 4 organizations on site, and the main works contractor has the app, but somehow they can't give access to the other organizations on site and that kind of. But those are just technicalities that can be resolved relatively quickly if people put their minds to it. I think it's it's emerging, I would say. But the first thing to think about is actually thinking about what data you have. I mean, I'm very happy to talk to people about this. We're actually trying to do some research in this space at the moment about how to accelerate the adoption of digitalization on site. You know, some of the challenges are, at the moment, we all have one of these in our pockets, a mobile phone, but we're not allowed to use them in certain parts of the site. So if you want to use QR codes to capture data or something like that, then you've got to decide where on site people are allowed to use what bits of kit to do that kind of thing. But again, these are all relatively simple things to do. You just have to think about them and work out what your solutions are. And then once you're capturing the data, to be capturing it to a database. And again, there's lots of solutions out there. You know, Microsoft has their whole Power App system and what have you. So it's beginning to emerge. I think the biggest challenges are, if you've got a big complicated site, and it probably all sits under the kind of lead contractor, they have to work out how they can share applications with the other organizations on site, and then explain to people what they're doing and why they're doing it and what the purpose is. And I think the other issue we have actually is more of a cultural one, that people don't want to have the idea that they're being watched and that they might get caught out doing something naughty, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is for us all to conserve our planetary resources and leave a better world to future generations. So, you know, we're not trying to smack people around the head with a stick. We're trying to say, let's all work together to do better. And let's learn from where we have problems, not sweep them under the carpet, which is a little bit of a tradition in our industry, I think, but to say, well, okay, we find in general that on sites we're using 30% more concrete than we should be doing. What are the causes of that? How do we work it out? And that's an industry-wide thing. That's not a site-wide thing. But, you know, even at a single site level, we can do an awful lot to just capture what we're doing and understand what materials are coming onto site, where they're going, and, you know, where we're sending them off in some kind of waste lorry, how we might avoid doing that in a positive way, rather than just pouring concrete onto the ground to get rid of it.
Thanks,
that never happens.
No, I'm sure never. Kai, from your perspective, turning the question that question around a little bit, are there, maybe if there aren't digital applications that are particularly mature, are there other places that people can go for guidance and support on how to make the switch and to make to provide help for thinking about things, I guess, as well as action? I mean,
obviously you can go to the UKGBC resources, which is wider circular economy, not specifically digitalization. So that would be a resource. There are the second-hand marketplaces out there, which are a good resource, still emerging, but a good resource for that. In terms of digital tools, wider, I don't see any tool that's just out there at the moment where you can say, okay, I take it away and I use it. However, there is great potential, especially to maybe add a little bit on the end of life scenario here for those tools. If you have the clarity on what happened to the building, when it was built, how it has been treated, when did you repair certain things, when did you exchange some certain materials, this alleviates a lot of the risk that people, and especially contractors, see if they want to reuse materials. It's traceable. You know what happened to it, so no one can say, this steel beam is too old, I don't know what happened to it. It might not be safe enough to reuse that. So there's a lot of potential there. And I mean, as I said, it's very emerging. There are also people thinking about, if we have those digital tools and we've the clarity of what sort of materials are in the buildings, we connect it all up and we can almost have a forecast on when do buildings come down, when are they nearing their end of life, and sort of forecast the amount of material that will be available so that architects can design to that. So there are lots of ideas floating around. None of that is really mature, but I think it's still worth engaging in that thought and see where that develops.
Yes, Kai. Tim, obviously your company's embarked on this journey and is using recycled materials. I mean, different companies might make different claims about how much recycled material they use. Are there sort of standards and things like that you guys use to reassure customers that you're not just making up these figures?
Yes, absolutely. We can get the data sheets and we can trace that back to the system, and we will have that substantiation. But I think that also then brings on to the EPDs and the LCAs, etc. So the life cycle assessments and the environmental product declarations that are now starting to come into the industry, where people are having to submit those declarations about the footprint of the product, about how it's got to where it is at that particular time, as part of the procurement process, so that those decisions can be made up front. And I think that's going to be one of the next changes moving forwards in the supply side of the industry. There's going to have to be a lot more credibility given and certainty given, because I think we're going to move to almost self-policing in that manner. But as you said, previously we could have made a lot of sweeping statements. I think there was this greenwashing element that sort of came out with sort of limited credibility. But I think members of the public are more aware of that now. I think companies are more aware of that now. I think there's a maturity that's come in over the last few years, that people are just much more environmentally aware now, and they're aware when the wool is being pulled over people's eyes. But as I say, so with regards to the life cycle assessments and the environmental product declarations that are coming in, I think you'll see that start to firm up exactly where things have come from and exactly where some of these claims have been made from. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it will help drive the circular economy as well, and also help with the data gathering that Jennifer and Kai have both said. The more data we have about these products, the more informed decisions that can be made, and we can then quantify it, measure it, and control it a lot more.
Tim, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that actually, that there's a lot that we can do sort of coming off the back of the post-Grenfell work, where obviously that was focused on safety, but it was very much about that golden thread of information and really knowing what we've got in buildings, that it has been installed correctly and all those sorts of things. So that is all about, really, fundamentally, it's about good data curation and good practice on site, I mean, and then, you know, documenting that good practice. So at that point, why not make sure that we're documenting the information about the materials that we're using? You know, and if we buy an HVAC system, all of those things have serial numbers on them, and we're probably logging those serial numbers. So it's not a massive stretch to then say, well, okay, you know, if we're bringing beams on site or something, that they have some kind of numbering system on them, and we know where they've come from, what batch they were from, etc., and they've gone into this building on this date. You know, we're already having to set up the systems for another purpose, so let's just extend their scope and use them as we get comfortable with them. So I think, you know, and similarly, most organisations having to deal with things like GDPR, which is about privacy and personal data. But again, that comes down to good data practices. So bring your GDPR team in and get them to talk to you about how they handle data and manage data and learn from them. You know, these things are happening even within our own organisations. It's just we're not deploying them in this context necessarily.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll move on to another question. There's a popular one here about whether the drive towards sustainability will in turn drive greater adoption of offsite methods. Jennifer, perhaps staying with you, is that a trend that you think will emerge? I mean, you talked about concrete deliveries, and obviously, if you're thinking about precasting concrete, then you know maybe there is no such thing as excess concrete. It just goes into more molds, etc. What do you think? I
think there is going to be, I mean, there already is an increasing move towards offsite manufacture, and whether that is component manufacture or whether that is, you know, entire rooms being created in some kind of factory environment. You know, I have mixed views about some of those things, because I don't think it's necessarily sustainable to be driving boxes of air up and down motorways. But, you know, we can, if you're building a big development, then you can set up an assembly unit on site, and then you can be assembling in the dry using well-managed processes, and it essentially becomes a nice temperature control factory, and everyone's much happier doing that than having to paddle around knee deep in mud on a wet November day, you know. So, but the great opportunity that brings is it simplifies processes on site. So you bring a lot of the skilled trades are then sort of in a controlled environment. You're not having to manage as many different trades on site at the same time. So it's not to say we're going to lose people, you know, people are going to lose their jobs. They're just going to be doing their jobs in a different environment. And that then means that we've got, you know, much better control of the systems and the elements that we are incorporating, and it becomes an assembly job the other thing, I'm not a big fan of the whole off-site manufacture phrase, because what that implies is that the site is not a factory. The site is a factory. It's building a one-off thing, but we are manufacturing something on a construction site. We're manufacturing a building or a bridge or a tunnel or whatever it is we're making. So we should bring that sort of manufacturing mindset as far as possible onto our construction sites. And the more that we can take the complex activity away from the construction site itself, the better, because that then, and it helps with safety and all kinds of things. It helps with handling, you've got much more consistency of what's going on. And, pouring concrete on site is inherently both a messy business and actually can be quite a dangerous business. So the more we can do elsewhere, and the more we can do things like Tim was talking about, using, temporary piles for temporary buildings and that kind of thing, the better, I think.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll take another question here from Matt Smith, who is a question I'm sure on many people's minds about the difficulties of supply of different materials we had over the past year. Kai, maybe you could comment on this. Obviously, the supply of materials has been very difficult over the past maybe 18 months, possibly even a bit longer. If I'm starting to try and bring in recyclable material, is that going to make matters better or worse in terms of the predictability and availability of materials? What do you think, Kai?
I mean, I think the short-term supply shortages should not necessarily be the main driver for that. It's just, I think, on a larger scale, the right thing to do, to use recyclable or recycled materials. I would distinguish between a couple of things here. It's whether something is recyclable, so meaning you can recycle it at the end of the life, or whether it contains recycled content. I would make this distinction. And then also whether it's a reused material. So if I'm reusing an entire component, or whether this component is manufactured using recycled content. Now, if you have something that's manufactured with recycled content, you still be ordering it from a factory. You still can go through the normal procurement process. So there's quite a lot of security in that one. And that doesn't really change in terms of the way we procure today. The challenge is when it comes to reused materials that had materials with a previous life, because then you can't just buy them off the shelf. You can't just say, I need this steel beam with these specification, this section, and that length, and I need 34 of this, please. So you need to work with availability. This means you either need to wait, or you need to design with more flexibility in mind, or design to availability. So yeah, I think circumnavigating short-term supply issues, choosing recycled materials can be a better solution to overcome them, but ultimately it's a challenge that we're trying to figure out at the moment, how to make this process a bit smoother.
Thanks, Kai. Jennifer, if you want
sorry, just to add briefly to what Kai was saying there, the increase in modularisation in construction will help with this, I think, because there's been a couple of big Innovate UK funded projects happen over the last 2 or 3 years, one led by the Construction Innovation Hub and one involving Lang O'Rourke, where they looked at modular solutions for, I think it was for schools, and having set distances. So it's not to say every building looks the same, but it's to say you have a set of parameters around which you design, and then you can have small rooms or larger rooms. You can have shorter or higher ceiling heights, but it's all done to a set of selections. So you don't, you haven't got the choice of I don't know, 1.8, 1.81 and 1.84. You've got the choice of 1.8 or 2. So, and actually these things are relatively easy to do once you get your mind around it. They don't have to constrain creativity in the way that a building looks, but they do then lend themselves to a market for reusable components, because you have standard sets. Whereas, as Kai said, when we're not doing that, it's much harder. You're sort of waiting around for something the right size to come along. And it might be that, there's an opportunity to do that within a sector where maybe buildings are sort of repurposed more often. Maybe less likely schools and more likely the commercial sector, actually, because commercial buildings are forever being torn down and replaced or refitted, aren't they? So.
Indeed they are, yes. Tim?
I just wanted to just completely agree with what Jennifer's just said there. I think the new dawn for modular building is on that horizon, because not only have we got, I think, the technology right now and the standards and the quality is so much better with the modular buildings that we're able to put together, but that element of customization is there now. It's not necessarily infinite, but it's a lot more than it used to be. And I think people aren't scared anymore that they're going to get exactly that, or that they can't choose that. And I think that is going to allow a greater adoption and a greater acceptance of modular elements to buildings, at least within the construction industry, because you don't lose that element of creativity. And I think that is one of the reasons I think this time modular buildings kicking in I think it's going to be here to stay moving forward.
And Tim, one of the things I know that Westgate's doing is acting as a collector of materials as well as a distributor of materials. Is that something you think you'll see a lot more of in the industry?
Yes, I think it's reverse logistics basically is becoming ever more important, because you need to make it easy for sites to use reusable materials, and to take it back from sites, it just takes one more job off that work site, and is one more reason why it doesn't need to go into a skip. If somebody's able to come collect that, bring it back and reuse it. From our point of view, we can take those items as modular items we put onto construction sites for use. We're able to apply those to different construction sites again in different formats. We can even use them on the same site for different phasings, etc. So yes, absolutely, reverse logistics is coming into its own really. All that really is asked of work sites is that things are stored safely and with respect, and then you can just come collect it and take it on. And I think with the durability of products as well having improved, that's just going to grow and grow, because the life cycle for that one particular item is extended, and it's able to be moved between work sites and repurposed and reused. You know, reuse, reduce, recycle, and that's where we are with that. And yeah, there's certainly a great uptake in that at this time.
Thanks, Tim. Kai, I saw your hand go up. I don't know if you still wanted to come in on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, Tim pretty much said it now. I was bringing like product as a service and take back schemes into the mix, because we're talking about two things here: the difficulty of procuring reused materials and also modular building. So if you then throw take back schemes in the mix, you can sort of then say, okay, the materials are already modular, they are standard sizes, and I know where they are. So if I just take them back and sell them again, I have a perfect business model there. And I, remember at the beginning when I said one of the main issues is the lack of proper infrastructure. Recyclability doesn't mean recycling, reusability doesn't mean reuse. If you have these kind of take back schemes or things like leasing models and product as a service, you just make sure that the manufacturer actually is in charge of this infrastructure that is lacking. So you sort of bypass that entire problem. And I think there's a lot of potential in that approach.
Thanks, Kai. Moving on to a question from Florence Spaven. And she's asking about the most effective ways to sort of drive this move. Jennifer, maybe you could say a word or two about this. I mean, I talked at the beginning of the in my introduction about the government moving to ask what you're doing about waste in terms of public sector procurement. Are we seeing enough of a drive, do you think, enough leadership on this issue? What do you think?
On the public sector
from clients or from government, where do you think the impetus is coming from?
I think some clients are doing well. I think the requirement to drive towards zero carbon is going to really push this. Circular economy isn't just about carbon, it's also about other resources. But, carbon being so high in the headlines, if we reduce the amount of material we use and reduce the amount of material we use and then reuse what we have already used, then obviously that's reducing carbon, but it also meets the circular economy challenge. I wouldn't say circular economy is currently sort of front and center of many clients that I've spoken to's agendas, other than sort of under the banner of carbon, I would say. But that said, there is now an increasing drive towards procurement being not just lowest first cost, and even not being lowest cost, but actually bringing in different value metrics into the equation. So again, the Construction Innovation Hub did a really nice piece of work on what they've called the value toolkit, which is a system that enables clients, or indeed contractors who are subcontracting to others, to start to specify and value things other than pounds and compare them. So, you know, you can start to put carbon or environmental impact, etc., in that procurement process and use it as part of both how you judge proposals, but also how you judge delivery of a project. So I think it's coming. I think, you know, the explicit focus on circular economy perhaps isn't quite there yet, but I think the appetite for it is there in that sort of broader sweep.
Thanks, Jennifer. Tim.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea that you put there, Lem. I mean, 25% roughly of construction work is public sector related. And that is a large enough body of work potentially to start dictating and setting some initial trends in place there. It is difficult in the public sector. They've got to try and balance the value for money for a taxpayer against sustainability goals. So there is a balancing act that they've got to undertake there. But I think they are probably in a good spot to be able to push forward and lead from the front in that. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to start.
Thanks, Tim. Back to Jennifer.
If I could just add on to Tim's point, yes, they do have to procure for value for the taxpayer, but I think the point I was making is that the concept of value is changing, and it's not just about immediate first cost, it's about other things, including the legacy that we're leaving to, you know, future generations, or even just to ourselves in 10 years' time. And I think that's a really positive move. And I think that's sort of being driven in the public sector. So there was a public procurement note came out in June of last year, all around procuring for value. And I think that's definitely a mindset shift in the last 5 years, I'd say.
Yes, those procurement policy notes, they do drive considerable change. And I think there was one in September which explicitly talked about Scope 3 emissions and within Scope 3 emissions, tackling the reduction of waste as well. So it's something that the government is slowly waking up to. We've only got a few minutes left. Kai, I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in. It's about whether there's a potential to see some disruption within the industry, whether sort of tech driven, or are the people going to come in and steal a march on their competitors by adopting these kinds of thinking? Is it going to provide great advantage for companies? Kai, what do you think?
Well, I think probably if there will be a disruption, then probably now or in the coming years, because now's the time. We have been traditionally quite a conservative industry. Tech is now coming into this sphere. With things that we've discussed, like material passports, modern methods of construction, prefabrication, and all of that, and the data that you have and the forecasts that you can use with data. So I think there's great potential for like tech startups disrupting the space. I can't give you a recipe for a successful company right here, but I think if that's the space you're working in, you're probably in a good place. Yeah.
Well, in that earlier question where we were talking about digital, it seems that that's still an early stage, isn't it? And there's great opportunity for companies with a vision to come in and help stitch these things together. So
exactly. My advice would be solve the issue of supply and demand, matching supply and demand, both in time as well as in storage. If you get some tech in there and manage that, then I think you'll have a successful business.
And I'm quickly going to squeeze in one last question, Tim. Carl Farrell was asking, are we seeing the transition from supplier to service provider when we think about a business like yours? If you're doing take back and what have you? So.
Absolutely. There's having that range of solutions that you can provide. Yeah, absolutely becomes a service as opposed to just a one-stop shop. So yes, we can help provide solutions, the design, the assurance that's required, and yeah, the full life cycle of that product. We can take it back and help our customers work towards their goals and their targets. So yeah, 100% agree with that. That's a really smart comment.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. We are out of time. So thank you very much for everyone who's joined this webinar. If you didn't manage to catch the whole thing, recording will be available for everybody who registered, so you'll be able to watch it at your leisure. Thanks very much to everyone who submitted questions. Apologies that we weren't able to cover all of them. Thanks to our sponsor Westgate for bringing today's event together. And thanks Jennifer, Kai and Tim for sharing your expertise. From all of us here, thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.